Somewhere in the Persian Gulf right now, a tanker captain is doing something insane. He's sailing straight through a strait his own government calls a war zone. No escort, no guarantee, just 17 million barrels of oil and a bet that the people shooting at each other don't actually mean it this time. On June 20th, 2026, Iran announced it had closed the Strait of Hormuz again. 55 ships sailed through it anyway, that same day. 17 million barrels of oil moved through a strait that, according to Iran's own military, didn't exist anymore. That's not a glitch in the data. That's the entire story of how this war is ending, quietly, messily, and almost by accident. And buried inside that contradiction is something every central bank on Earth has been waiting 4 months to find out: whether the inflation problem is actually over. Here's the part most people miss. This wasn't a skirmish. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes inside Iran. Within hours, Iran's supreme leader was dead. Within days, Iran did the one thing every oil trader had nightmares about for 50 years. It moved to choke the Strait of Hormuz, one waterway, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Roughly a fifth of all the oil the planet burns passes through it every single day. Block it and you're not raising prices at the pump. You're rewriting the global cost of everything that touches energy: fertilizer, shipping, plastics, electricity, food. By late March, Brent crude hit $114 a barrel. By April, it touched $138. Gas in parts of California crossed $6 a gallon. The Dallas Fed didn't call it a shock anymore. They called it the largest single oil supply disruption in modern market history. And inflation, which America had spent 3 brutal years trying to cool, came roaring back to 4.2%. So when a ceasefire finally got signed on June 17th, Trump and Iran's president at a dinner table in Versailles, of all places, the instinct was to exhale. Crisis over, print the headline, move on. Except that's not actually what happened. And understanding why is where this gets interesting. Let's strip away the politics for a second, because underneath all of it is a remarkably simple mechanism. Oil isn't just a commodity. It's an input cost hiding inside almost every other price you pay. Diesel moves the truck that delivers your groceries. Jet fuel flies the plane that ships your packages. Natural gas, which often travels the same choke points as oil, makes the fertilizer that grows your food. When the price of crude jumps, it doesn't politely stay in the gasoline category of your budget. It leaks into everything. Economists have a name for this. They call it pass-through. A 10% rise in oil prices doesn't show up as a 10% rise anywhere obvious. It shows up 6 weeks later as a slightly higher grocery bill, a slightly higher airline ticket, a slightly higher heating bill. Dozens of tiny invisible taxes you never see itemized. Multiply that across an entire economy, and you get what the Fed's own researchers modeled out in painful detail. A 1/4 closure of the Strait of Hormuz alone was enough to push headline inflation up by more than 0.5 percentage point for the rest of the year. A 3/4 closure pushed it past a full point. This is the part that should make you slightly uncomfortable. The Federal Reserve cannot fix this kind of inflation. Raising interest rates fixes inflation caused by too much demand, people borrowing and spending too freely. It does almost nothing against inflation caused by a tanker that physically cannot leave a port. You can't out-hike a war. The Fed chair can talk tough in every press conference he wants. Geography doesn't care. There's a second mechanism hiding underneath the first one, and it's even sneakier. It's called expectation. If a business owner believes oil prices are going to stay high for a year, they don't wait for costs to actually rise before raising their own prices. They raise them now, just in case. A trucking company quotes higher freight rates for contracts 6 months out. A factory locks in supplier prices assuming the disruption continues. None of that requires the war to actually get worse. It only requires people to believe it might. This is why central banks watch something called the 5 to 10-year inflation expectation survey almost obsessively. Short-term price spikes from oil are usually temporary and self-correcting. But once people start baking permanently higher prices into contracts, wages, and business plans, the inflation stops being a supply problem and starts being a psychological one. And those are brutally hard to undo once they take hold. That's the scenario Dallas Fed researchers were the most worried about. Not the price of oil today. What everyone quietly assumes about the price of oil 18 months from now. So here's the number that actually matters, and almost nobody is saying it out loud. The May CPI report, released right before the ceasefire was even signed, came in at 4.2%, the highest reading since 2023. And that number was baked in by Brent crude averaging $107 a barrel in May. A ceasefire signed on June 17th does nothing to that number. It's already cooked into the data. Inflation reports look backward. The ceasefire looks forward. There's a lag, usually 6 to 8 weeks, between an oil price falling and that relief actually reaching a grocery receipt. Which means the headline saying, "Ceasefire ends inflation crisis in June," we're describing a future that hadn't arrived yet, layered on top of a present that was still ugly. And then there's the part that's almost darkly funny, if you're the kind of person who finds dark humor in trillion-dollar markets. 2 days after a so-called peace deal, Iran announced it was closing the strait again, this time over a completely different conflict in Lebanon. The US military said the strait never actually closed. 55 ships went through it that same day, carrying a record 17 million barrels. So picture the absurdity of that moment. A country declares a major choke point shut. Commercial shipping just doesn't notice. Oil prices kept falling anyway, down near $78 a barrel, the lowest level since the war began. Because traders had already decided the closure was theater, not physics. The market didn't believe the war, it believed the vibes. This is where you have to separate two very different stories that are wearing the same headline. Story 1, the hype. Iran ceasefire ends global inflation scare. Clean, simple, shareable. Oil down, inflation solved, central banks relax, everyone exhaled. Story 2, the reality. A fragile 60-day memorandum of understanding, not a peace treaty. A strait that Iran has declared closed twice and reopened twice, depending on what's happening in an entirely separate war next door, in Lebanon. A US president openly threatening to start charging tolls on Hormuz if the deal collapses. Oil markets pricing in the best case outcome while quietly hedging for the worst one, which is exactly what that price gap between near-term and long-term oil futures contracts has been signaling for days. One analyst put it bluntly, crude's slide right now is entirely sentiment-driven. Markets are betting on the best version of a story whose actual ending hasn't been written yet. That's not a ceasefire. That's a country with its hands still resting on the valve. Now widen the lens, because the inflation story was never really about America. The UK is bracing for inflation above 5% this year. Germany's growth forecast got cut to 0.6%. The World Bank slashed its global growth outlook to the lowest level since the pandemic. Gulf economies that depend almost entirely on those tankers moving freely saw growth forecasts cut from 4.5% down to 1.3%. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, countries with no involvement in this war whatsoever, got hit with fuel rationing and currency pressure because their entire energy supply runs through a strait two countries were fighting over. This is the quiet truth about modern inflation. It isn't really a domestic policy story anymore. It's a geography story. A handful of waterways, a handful of producers, and every economy on the planet downstream of a decision made in a war room thousands of miles away. Think about how strange that actually is. A central banker in Frankfurt doing everything textbook correct, managing demand, watching wages, holding rates at the right level, can still watch inflation rise because of a military decision in a strait he has zero influence over. All the domestic policy tools in the world don't help when the shock arrives by tanker. And the next fragile point in that chain is already visible. A Qatari LNG terminal explosion in the middle of all this just removed nearly 5 million tons of annual gas export capacity. At the exact moment Europe is trying to refill storage before next winter. Nobody's pricing that in yet. They will. So where does this actually leave us? The Fed held rates steady at its June meeting, not because inflation looked good, it didn't, but because raising rates into a war-driven supply shock would have slowed the economy without actually lowering a single price at the pump. That's the trap. Tighten, and you risk a recession on top of an oil shock. Hold, and you risk inflation expectations drifting upward and becoming sticky. The exact thing every central banker fears more than the number itself. The next real test isn't this week's headline. It's the July CPI report, the first one that will actually reflect June's falling oil prices. If that number drops meaningfully, the ceasefire ended the inflation scare story becomes true, just 2 months later than the headlines claimed. If it doesn't, it means the damage already done to expectations, contracts, and shipping costs has outlived the war that caused it. Here's the uncomfortable possibility nobody on cable news wants to sit with. This ceasefire didn't end the story. It paused it mid-sentence in a region where the last 3 final agreements all came with an asterisk. The strait has been declared closed and reopened twice in a single week. The peace is 60 days old and already conditional on a war happening somewhere else entirely. Markets have priced in the ending they want. Whether reality agrees with them is still being decided. One tanker, one Geneva phone call, one Lebanese ceasefire violation at a time. So the real question isn't whether the Iran ceasefire reset the inflation story. It's whether anyone actually has the authority to write the ending, or whether, 4 months in, the story is still writing itself.